All the Young Dudes, Sirius's Perspective by Rollercosterwords. Chapter 131, 7th Year, Interlude.
You sexy thing, you. I believe in miracles. Since you came along, you sexy thing.
Tuesday, the 24th of January, 1978. 7:50 a.m. A handful of people in Gryffindor Tower used alarm clocks. If Sirius found himself, against his best efforts, walking through the hallway outside the dormitory doors in the early morning, he could sometimes hear them, shrill ringing or loud blaring, or, for those more experienced with acoustic charms, perhaps even some nice soothing music. Sirius did not have an alarm clock. What he had was James Potter. "Oi, Padfoot, get up! Nearly 8, you lazy sod." "I've got a free study day, arsehole. Piss off," Sirius grumbled, shoving his head under his pillow. "You'll miss breakfast." "Ugh. Fine. Starve then." Sirius could practically hear James rolling his eyes through the bed curtains. As he began to shuffle around again, he called out, "Seen Mooney? His bed's empty. Don't think he should be off on his own, do you?" Sirius lifted his head, hesitating. The simplest answer to that question would be, "Yes, James, I have seen Mooney. In fact, I'm seeing rather a lot of him right now, as he's currently lying right next to me." But the boy in question was giving Sirius a very frantic look, a look which clearly communicated that he did not want James Potter made aware that he had spent the night sleeping next to Sirius, as if James and Sirius hadn't shared a bed plenty of times. Still, Sirius obliged. Half because he didn't want to make Mooney uncomfortable, and half because he found it amusing how the tables had turned. While before it had been Remus urging him to be more open about their relationship, now that their friends actually knew they were shagging, the private boy seemed determined to do everything in his power to convince them that the opposite was true. "Probably gone for breakfast, mate," Sirius shouted through the curtains. "Yeah, maybe." There was a bit more shuffling. Then, "Oh, hang on, I'll check the map. He's left it on his bedside table." Remus pulled a face, grimacing at himself as he slapped his own forehead. Sirius bit his lip to keep from smiling. "I'm in here, James," Remus called out, face almost as red as the bed curtains. "Oh!" James went abruptly still, all sounds of movement halting. "Oh! Right, of course. Sorry, I didn't think." The footsteps suddenly started up again, retreating towards the door. "Sorry, lads. See you later, eh?" The door slammed open, then shut, and then there was the distant sound of footsteps down the stone stairs. Sirius fell back onto his pillow, laughing, as Remus groaned in embarrassment. The poor boy crawled under the sheets again to hide. "Oh, come on," Sirius snorted, trying to yank the sheets away. "Wasn't that bad?" "It's horrible," Remus moaned, burrowing deeper. "I'll never be able to look him in the eye again." Sirius huffed and crawled under the sheets after him. "It's not like we were doing anything. You've still got your pajamas on." "Prongs doesn't know that," Remus replied, pouting. He was sitting cross-legged, with the sheets draped over his head like a tent. Sirius smiled, reaching out to play with his fingers. "I don't see what all the fuss is about," he tutted, running his own hand over the calluses on the pads of Remus's thumbs, the scars across his knuckles, the lines on his palms. He pressed their hands together, then wiggled his fingers through Remus's, bending them up and down aimlessly. "I'm sure he already assumes some things." "See? You can't say it either." "Well, I'm a gentleman." Sirius looked up through his lashes as he said it, smirking. It was perhaps not the most accurate statement, seeing as he was presently having some decidedly ungentlemanly thoughts about Remus's fingers, and what he could do with them. At least we know we've got the room to ourselves," Sirius murmured, leaning to catch the other boy's mouth. Remus kissed him, but broke away before he could move any further. "No way. If we don't go down right now, James is definitely going to think we're shagging." "Being physically intimate," Remus sniffed primly. Sirius couldn't help the laughter that bubbled out of his throat. He flopped back onto the bed. "Oh, Mooney, you kill me. What happened to that rough little yob I used to know?" Some posh boy taught me how to read, Remus quipped, smiling wryly as he flung back the covers and rubbed at his staticky curls. Right, quick shower, then we'll go down. He yawned as he hopped out of bed, stretching. Sirius popped his head on his arm. I like the sound of that. He wiggled his eyebrows suggestively as Remus moved towards the bathroom, smirking when the taller boy paused in the doorway. Downstairs, pervert. 8:30 a.m. It wasn't like Sirius wasn't self-conscious about it. He was. He understood where Remus was coming from. He wasn't keen on the idea that it might change things, that James might suddenly see him differently, as less of a man or whatever. But somehow Sirius felt as though shrinking away from it would only make things worse. If he just acted as though it didn't bother him, then maybe, eventually, it wouldn't. Besides, it was a familiar role to play. Sirius had been throwing his sex life in the rest of his friends' faces for the past year. It wasn't as if they didn't already know that he shagged. And it wasn't his fault if his mates were a bunch of prudes. A fact that was made abundantly clear that morning at breakfast, where Mary spent most of the meal breaking down all the pros and cons of the Hufflepuff Quidditch player she was currently seeing. I mean, obviously he's fit. Like, Adonis level, she said, eyes glazing over for a moment. And talk about stamina. Lily was trying to suppress her giggles by pressing her hand to her mouth. James was staring straight down at his tea with a slightly mortified expression, and Remus was shoveling eggs onto his plate, looking as if he were only half paying attention. But then, Mary smirked impishly, he has the gall to whine about thigh chafing on his bloody broom. She shook her head, laughing. Sirius tried desperately to catch James's eye, recalling all the times Potter had moaned about the pains of chafing. But the other boy refused to look up, cheeks gone red as his girlfriend's hair. Mary leaned in conspiratorially, still with that same evil smirk. I told him, if he thinks that's uncomfortable, he should try bleeding from his snatch 5 days a month. Peter nearly spat out his porridge. Lily dropped her head into her hands, and Marlene whipped around, glaring. Fucking hell, Mary! Do you have to? What? Mary asked innocently. Sirius had to bite his lip to keep from laughing. Well, you're being a bit graphic for the breakfast table, Lily said carefully, glancing at Marlene. We're all adults, aren't we? Mary gave her a flat stare. We're mature enough to talk about sex. Right, I'd better be off. James almost knocked over his tea as he stood abruptly, bumping into the table. Lily turned to him, brow furrowed. Where are you going? Potions! It's not for another 15... Okay, wait, I'll come with you. She shook her head, bemused, and stood to follow him. I didn't know James was such a prude, Mary said, pouring herself more coffee as the couple disappeared out the door. Oh, it wasn't you, MacDonald. Sirius yawned, grinning as he reached up to tussle his hair. Prongsy boy just had a bit of a surprise this morning. Ow! Remus's shoe just made contact with his shin under the table. When Sirius looked over, the tall boy was giving him a meaningful look, brows raised and lips pursed into a thin line, which said, Shut it, you prat. Before Sirius could retaliate, the morning post arrived, and he was distracted by the owls swooping into the great hall. He didn't receive anything himself, but Remus got 2 letters dropped onto his plate. He snatched them up immediately, scanning them. After a moment, he grinned and passed the first letter over to Sirius. It was a crude postcard from Grant, with a man on the seaside holding a jutting piece of rock in front of his crotch. On the back, written in truly atrocious chicken scratch, it said, Saw this and thought of you. Looking for flats next week, love. Sirius grimaced. He turned back to Remus, watching him read the second letter, which was suitably longer. Once he'd finished, Sirius caught his eye. Anything from... He trailed off, raising his eyebrows. Remus gave a little shrug and shook his head. Nothing from his mother, then. Sirius smiled encouragingly. Still time, though, eh? Remus shrugged again. Go into the library, see if I can find any of these before History and Magic. He held up the second letter, which appeared to contain a list of titles, then nodded towards Mary and Marlene. See you later, girls. See you in the hospital wing this evening? Marlene asked, looking up from her plate. Remus had been joining in on the extracurricular healing lessons that Madame Pomfrey gave to interested students, though he'd been absent for the past 2 weeks due to his preparation for Dumbledore's mission. "Of course," Remus smiled. "See you then." Sirius trotted alongside him as they made their way towards the library, looking forward to his free day. Remus had class in the morning, but they'd have lunch all together with their friends, and then after that, if they were lucky, the dorm might be free. Next to him, Remus appeared to be deep in thought, staring straight ahead with his brow furrowed. Whatever he was thinking about, he was concentrating on it so hard that he completely missed the library, blowing past it with his long strides. "Remus?" No response. He continued walking. "Moony." Still nothing. "Moony! Earth calling planet Moony." Finally, Remus paused. "We just walked past the library, if that's where you were heading." "Oh, bollocks." Remus spun around, hurrying back down the corridor. Sirius followed after him. "Care to share?" "Oh, nothing. Just thinking." "Not worrying, I hope, about tonight?" It was the full moon. Remus always seemed to get a bit introspective and withdrawn around those, and after what had happened with the werewolves, there was now the added threat of an attack. Sirius supposed he could understand why Moony might be a bit preoccupied. A bit." They fell silent as they entered the library, walking quietly past Madame Pince's desk so not to incur her wrath. "I don't think we ought to leave the shack tonight," Remus said under his breath, once they were safely past. "If anything happens..." "It won't. Dumbledore's dealing with it." Sirius didn't exactly consider himself Dumbledore's #1 fan after what had happened with Remus's werewolf mission. But the headmaster was still the most powerful wizard in the world. If he'd promised to handle it, Sirius had no doubts that he'd be able to. "I know," Remus said, scanning the bookshelves. "But I'd like you to respect my wishes, if it's all the same to you." "Hey, don't be like that." Sirius reached out to squeeze his shoulder briefly. "Of course we will. Anything for our Moony." After a few minutes of searching, Remus selected 3 books and returned to Pince's desk to check them out. He was just about to shove them into his book bag when Sirius held out his hands. "I'll take them," he said gamely. "You don't want to be lugging them around all day. I'm going back to the dorm anyway." "Oh, cheers." Remus passed the books over with a distracted smile. "Are you going to start on that arithmetic essay?" "Not if I can possibly avoid it," Sirius grimaced. "See you at lunch? You're free this afternoon, aren't you?" Yeah, but I'm supposed to be seeing Christopher. Then there's that essay you're not doing, and the healing class. And I really want to write back to Ferox today if I can. I think he likes getting it in the post, since he's not allowed out much." "Merlin, Remus," Sirius frowned, heart sinking. "You've got to be in the shack by 6. "I'm aware." Remus adjusted his book bag, glancing away. "And you're planning to eat?" Sirius asked, running over the itinerary Moony had just rattled off in his head. "When have I ever forgotten a meal?" Remus asked, which wasn't really an answer, with a playful smile. "Anyway, I have to run. History. See you at lunch." 10:45 a.m. It wasn't like he needed to spend the afternoon with Remus. Sirius had plenty of friends, and there was certainly enough homework to get done if he was really desperate for something to do. Besides, he knew that Remus had his own life. It was just that life always seemed to be so busy, and lately Sirius had begun to wonder if Moony was wearing himself too thin, especially with the full moon coming up. He ought to be resting, not running madly all over the castle until the very last minute, and Sirius had that spliff he'd charmed off a Ravenclaw, which would have been the perfect thing to get him to relax. Sirius was just putting on the finishing touches to the arithmetic essay when James walked through the door, whistling. He faltered for a moment when he saw Sirius, but then plastered a smile on his face. "Hiya." He moved towards his wardrobe, not quite meeting Sirius's eye as he spoke. "Quidditch?" Sirius asked, watching the other boy pull out his kit. He nodded. "Quick session before lunch. Got to work with Ericsson. What have you been up to?" "Homework." "Homework?" James spun around to stare at him, shocked, taking in the books and paper spread across his bed. For a moment, the stiff cheerfulness slipped, and James sounded more like himself as he asked, "Who are you and what have you done with Padfoot?" Sirius laughed, settling down his quill. Trying to get that arithmancy essay out of the way for me and Mooney, he said, pausing for the slightest moment as he wondered whether or not to bring up what had happened that morning. Fuck it. James already knew about him and Remus. It was too late to take it back. If he was going to be weird about it, Sirius would just have to keep throwing it in his face until he got used to the idea. Wanted to make sure me and Remus had the afternoon free. You know. Sirius smirked, raising his eyebrows suggestively. James went bright red. Oh! He spun around, yanking off his shirt to change. Right! Sirius rolled his eyes. Merlin, James, don't be such a prude. You can't pretend you haven't snuck Lily up here for a cheeky shag. James yanked his Quidditch robes on so quickly that he nearly knocked his glasses off his face, still keeping his back turned to Sirius. The silence went on for a moment too long. Prongs? James had gone uncharacteristically stiff, pulling on his leather Quidditch gloves. Sirius felt a wicked smile begin to creep across his face. Prongsy, he sing-songed. Come on, you really haven't? James turned around, finally, and the mortified embarrassment on his face said it all. Sirius threw back his head, cackling. Oh, Godric, he gasped, incredulous. You've been seeing her for 6 months. Are you telling me that Evans really hasn't deflowered you yet? James blushed furiously, staring at the ground. We've done other things, he said, defensively. Not that that's any of your business. Sirius couldn't stop laughing. I can't believe that the James Potter, Hogwarts' head boy and captain of the Gryffindor Quidditch team, is still well, you don't have to go around broadcasting it. James snapped ruefully. What in Merlin's name are you waiting for? I'm not waiting for anything, he protested. I don't want to get it wrong. Sirius settled back, arms behind his head, smirking. Well, if you need any advice, you can always just ask, bye, Padfoot. See you later, prick. James darted out the door, letting it slam shut behind him. Sirius was still chuckling about their conversation 2 hours later, when he headed down to the common room to see if anyone was around he could bother for lunch. Unfortunately, all of his friends were absent. James and Marlene were likely still at Quidditch practice, and he figured that Peter was probably out watching them, or off somewhere with Dorcas. He had no idea where Lily and Mary were. Sirius supposed he could see if Remus had left the map on his bedside table again to check, but he didn't particularly feel like walking back upstairs. Fortunately, he just so happened to spot a familiar mousy blonde head. Oi, Christopher! The prefect jumped and glanced up from the chair where he was reading, shutting his book quickly and shoving it into his bag. Oh, Sirius, he blinked nervously. Can I help you with something? Sirius leaned against the wall next to his chair, staring down haughtily. Just wanted to let you know that Mooney's going to have to cancel this afternoon. What? You wanted to study together, right? Well, he isn't feeling well, so I'm afraid he won't be able to make it. Christopher frowned. Oh, did Remus tell you that? Or, yep, Sirius said, popping his lips at the end of the word. Right, the younger boy looked down. Okay, thanks for letting me know. Oh, don't mention it, Sirius grinned, pushing off the wall and heading for the portrait to make his way down for lunch. 1:50 p.m. He had been waiting, alone, at the table for a solid 15 minutes before Remus came rushing breathlessly in. The rest of their friends had already left, having arrived for lunch at a normal time rather than the 10 minutes before the meal would end. Sorry, Remus panted, sliding into his seat. Stayed back to talk to Kettleburn, then remembered I'd forgotten my notes from Professor Binns. History was a bloody waste too, all stuff I've covered in the reading. Oh, thank you. The last bit was said in response to the plate of sausage and mash that Sirius had nudged towards him. Remus began to eat at a truly astonishing speed, practically inhaling his food and continuing to speak rapidly between bites. Anyway, all worked out nicely in the end. I used to write the letter to Ferox and a note for Grant, so at least that's done. What's that? Looking down at the stack of parchment Sirius had placed in front of him, trying to read as he chugged his glass of pumpkin juice. Arithmancy. Your essay, Sirius explained. I finished mine like a good boy, so I thought I'd do yours too. You what? Remus stared up at him, shocked. I don't believe you. How many times have you done it for Wormy? Or James, for that matter? He's still got a stick up his arse about this morning, by the way. Won't talk to me about it. Anyway, now that's done, and the letters, you're free this afternoon. Thanks so much, Padfoot. Honestly, this is brilliant. But I did promise Christopher, and... Nope. Sirius couldn't suppress the smug smile that crept across his face. I just saw him. Told him you weren't very well, so you couldn't see him. Sirius. Well, you're not very well, Sirius pointed out. What with tonight? You want to be resting. I'll be fine once I've eaten, Remus said, frowning as he looked back down at his plate. Sirius studied his face, smile fading away. Was Remus upset with him? He supposed it had been a bit presumptuous to talk to Chris like that. But who would actually want to spend the afternoon studying when they could do, well, literally anything else? Angry with me? He asked once Remus had finished eating. No, the other boy sighed. But you can't just reorganise my life like that, just to get your own way. I didn't mean it like that, Sirius straightened, feeling a kick of guilt. You always have so much on, and it's insane. I mean, it's amazing because you're amazing, and you can handle it, but you don't have to. Okay, Remus said wryly, hauling his school bag up onto his shoulder as he stood. Sirius pushed away from the table too, following him out the great hall. And you'd written so many notes for that essay, it practically wrote itself, he continued, fumbling to explain. And we can go and find Christopher if you want. He's probably in the library. Sirius. Remus shook his head, exasperated. Go on, I'll post the letters for you, and I'll see you early for dinner. Sirius. Remus paused, staring down at him, and Sirius stopped walking too. Oh, bugger, he scowled, remembering. I can't do early dinner. I've got that detention with Filch. Only for an hour, though. I'll be out in time for... Sirius. Remus spoke sharply, interrupting him. What? Sirius glanced up anxiously, in time for Remus to take him by the chin, tilting his face up for a kiss. Shut up, you idiot, he murmured, smiling. I'd much rather spend the afternoon with you than studying with Christopher. Oh, Sirius bit his lip, smiling back as his heart began turning in flips. 2:15 p.m. The spliff had been an excellent idea. Hardly 20 minutes later, Sirius lay with his head resting against Remus's hip, mellow and boneless, and tapping his fingers along to the Bowie record that was spinning at the end of the bed. Remus seemed just as relaxed, lying with an arm behind his head, propped up on the pillows as he inhaled deeply. Does the wolf get stoned too? Sirius asked, stretching up a hand high for the joint. Hungrier, probably, Remus replied, passing it over. Sirius breathed in, letting smoke fill his lungs. He exhaled, watching the hazy cloud leave his lips. James would give them shit if they didn't get up to crack open a window soon. But somehow, Sirius couldn't be bothered, content to remain exactly where he was. Can I ask you something? Remus mumbled from somewhere above his head. Fire away, Mooney. What was Mary on about this morning? About the Hufflepuff keeper's stamina. I think she was blagging, honestly. Not that. Remus shook his head. The bleeding thing. Bleeding from, what's she mean? Sirius turned sharply to look up at him, unsure on whether Remus was joking. She's talking about, her time of the month. He trailed off, waiting for Remus to get it. But the other boy only stared blankly, waiting for him to go on. What's that? Remus, seriously? What? Oh, girls are different from boys. Well, I know that, Remus muttered defensively. Sirius bit back a smile. Okay, so girls get this thing every month. He did his best to explain, watching in amusement as Remus's expression grew more and more horrified. That's the most disgusting thing I've ever heard, he said once Sirius was done. It's natural, Sirius replied automatically. Mary hated it whenever anyone made comments about how gross it was. After listening to a few of her rants, he'd had the response drilled into him. I'll get Lily to explain it to you. I probably told it wrong. Bloody hell, you're nearly 18. How did you not know? Oh yeah, make fun of the care home kid, Remus scowled. I grew up in a boys' reformatory. How am I supposed to know anything about girls? Explains a lot, Sirius teased. Remus flicked his ear in retaliation. Ow! What's your detention for, anyway? The taller boy switched the subjects, getting comfortable once more on the pillow. Hexed Crouch. Oh, right. Him and my darling brother were tormenting some second years, but obviously he got out of it because he's a prefect. Sirius frowned, thinking back on the incident. He was going to stop using the map to spy on his brother. Really, he was. It was creepy and weird and honestly sort of pathetic. But all of his friends had been busy, and Sirius had found himself pulling the parchment out from Remus's bedside table, just to check. When he saw Regulus Black and Bartimus Crouch Jr. hovering next to two unfamiliar names in an empty classroom, he'd known immediately that something was off. Sirius hadn't meant for any professors to get involved. It had just been a bit of bad luck that the second years he'd sent scurrying off went straight to Flitwick, who walked in just as he hit Crouch with a stinging jinx. The small professor had broken the whole thing up before it could go any further, doling out detentions to both Sirius and Barty. But, of course, Regulus had pulled out his prefect badge, insisting that he'd been trying to stop the fight between the two boys. Ought to try and ignore them if you can, Remus said, bringing Sirius's attention back to the present. I know he bothers you, but it's better to stay out of it. School's over soon. I know, Sirius said, trying to ignore the hollow ache that came with those words. Would he ever see Reg again, after he left Hogwarts? He took another hit at the joint, trying to chase the thought from his mind. Remus reached down, snagging Sirius's wrist with his long fingers. Sirius stared, mesmerised, as Moony dragged his hand to his mouth. He placed the end of the spliff, still stuck between Sirius's own fingers, into his mouth, and sucked, smirking sinfully when he released his grip. Fuck. Any other day, it might have been enough to distract him, but Sirius stood to flip the record over to the B-side. He couldn't quite manage to shake the thoughts of his brother from his head. I suppose I just don't want him to hurt anyone, he said, lying back down. Remus frowned. That's not your job. Feels like it, Sirius sighed, taking a moment to stretch. You don't know what he was like when we were kids. He's not cruel, dark, like them. I don't know. I don't want him to do something he'll regret later on. He wasn't sure why he was talking about it. Probably the weed. Sirius usually tried to avoid the subject of his brother, when it came to his friends, even with James, especially with James. It wasn't that he didn't think they would listen. They would. Sirius knew they would. Remus was listening right now. But he just didn't know if they would hear him, if they could understand. Everything was so much simpler from their point of view. The Black family were evil, hateful bigots, and Regulus had thrown his lot in with them. That made him a shitty person, undeserving of sympathy or pity or even Sirius's time. He had made his choice. It was his to live with. Sirius knew that. He did. So how did he explain that he still missed him sometimes? How did he explain that he looked at Regulus and didn't see a Death Eater the way his friends did? How did he explain that he still saw his baby brother, only thinner and paler and more dead around the eyes? How did he explain that despite the urge to see him, to speak to him, to ask if he was okay, it was ridiculous that he would walk in on his brother tormenting a helpless 12-year-old and still think that he was the one that needed saving? It was stupid. I tell you something, Remus asked. Sirius shook off his thoughts. A secret? He crawled up the mattress so that they were sitting side by side. Sort of. But it's about Regulus. You might not want to hear it. Sirius stiffened. Part of him wanted to cover his ears, but another part of him, a larger one, was hungry for any piece of information he could get about his brother. Go on. Remember the boggart that got me and Chris before Christmas? How could I forget? Remus had told them all about it, how they had stumbled upon a shadow in the hallway, how Christopher had disappeared into the darkness, how Remus had followed and found him facing down a shambling corpse that had then, abruptly, transformed into a full moon. Wish I'd been there. Never seen a boggart. Werewolves not exciting enough for you now, Remus asked dryly. Anyway, I checked the map right after Chris went to go get someone. And, well, I'm pretty sure it was Regulus who put the boggart there. He and Barty were nearby. Oh. Sirius absorbed the words, feeling the dull, hollow ache that they caused, like pressing on a bruise. It was a familiar sort of pain. Remus was watching him. Stupid prick. He looked down at the bed, fidgeting with the spliff between his fingers. It's all her, you know. He's an idiot for wanting to please her, obviously. But it's all her fault anyway. Your mother? He nodded once, still not meeting Remus's eye. Words bubbled up in his throat, all the things that he wanted desperately to say. It wasn't supposed to be like this. This isn't who he is. If it weren't for her influence, he would never have become this. He doesn't want it. He can't want it. You can't believe he wants it. It's my fault. I should have tried harder. I should have made him leave. Remus reached over, fingers brushing gently against Sirius's jaw. When Sirius turned to look at him, his eyes were dark, half-lidded, warm and soft and unbearably sweet. Let's forget about all that shit, he murmured. It's boring. Sirius kissed him, swallowing the words. They sat heavy like a stone in the pit of his stomach. Chapter 132. 7th year. Victims. The wolf wanted out. He made that very clear. The night started normal enough. The transformation went as smoothly as it could be hoped, though it never got any easier to watch. They had already decided to stay in the shack, per Remus's wishes, and so the marauders had left the door locked and the charms in place before they transformed. At first, things seemed to be going all right. The wolf was a bit energetic, a bit wound up, but play fighting and Chase the rat seemed to be doing enough to keep him occupied. Padfoot had barked and wagged his tail, and they had raced in circles together around the room. But as the night wore on, something changed. The wolf grew more and more restless, pausing to sniff the air and howl. Eventually he began to throw himself at the door, growling and whining and scratching. Prongs tried to block him, but that only seemed to make him more frantic. Padfoot tackled him, thinking to distract him with more play fighting, but the snarl that ripped from the wolf's throat in response was not very playful at all. Nor were the jaws that locked around his leg, biting down too hard for it to be a game. Padfoot wiggled free and growled, but the wolf launched itself back towards the door. He tried to cut it off. The wolf swiped at him, claws slicing through his flesh, knocking him back into the wall. Padfoot whimpered as he slumped down onto the ground in a tangle of limbs, and Prongs cantered between them, snorting. Wormtail ran circles on the floor, which wasn't helpful in the slightest. Until sunrise, Sirius thought vaguely. We just have to make it until sunrise. The next few hours were spent playing what felt like a very dangerous game of chicken, in which Padfoot and Prongs tried to push or pull or coax the wolf away from the door, only to have him turn on them, snarling. They would spend the next few minutes dancing away from the snapping jaws until the wolf lost interest and returned to the door. By the time the sun finally began to rise, they were all utterly exhausted. The transformation back was worse. It was nothing that Sirius had ever seen before, as if the wolf wasn't ready to leave, as if he was fighting to hold on. He panted and whined and howled on the floor, bones cracking, body shrinking. The second that Remus had settled back into shape, Sirius transformed, rushing over to kneel at his side. He's not waking up. Prongs, why isn't he waking up? James knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse. Peter hovered behind, chewing on his lip. It's all right, James said after a moment. He's breathing. It's all right. I think it's just taking a bit longer for him to wake up. Okay, Sirius nodded, feeling slightly hysterical. Okay, when will he wake up, though? I don't know. Mate, you're bleeding. Sirius looked down. 3 stripes of blood were soaking through his shirt. After a moment, his brain caught up, and he realised he was in pain. It's fine. It's nothing. Are you sure? Guys, Peter interrupted, shifting anxiously from foot to foot. Pomfrey will be here soon. If we don't go, she'll catch us. Bugger! James glanced down at the window, running a hand through his hair. You're right, Pete. He looked back down at Remus, frowning. I'm sure he'll be all right. Pomfrey will know what to do. And I don't see any serious injuries. I think he's just passed out, Pads. I'm not leaving him, Sirius growled. Not until he wakes up. Not until I know he's all right. Mate, I'm not leaving, James. He glared. After a moment, the other boy relented. Right, we'll have to leave the cloak for you. What? Peter yelped indignantly, and sneak back down now, before Pomfrey's on her way down the tunnel. James gave Peter a sharp look as he finished his sentence, and then the other boy shrank back, abashed. I'm sure we'll be fine to sneak back into the castle. No one's up at this hour anyway, and if we do run into someone, you can transform Pete, and I'll play the head boy card. Peter nodded, mollified. James cast one bad look at Remus, before passing the invisibility cloak over to Sirius, assuring him that he would write to his parents, and try to find out if something had happened. He snuck out with Peter at his heels, and once they had disappeared, Sirius turned back to the unconscious boy on the floor. Remus? Remus? He knew that he probably shouldn't, but he grabbed Remus's shoulders anyway, shaking him roughly. Wake up! It seemed to do the trick. What? His eyes snapped open, and Sirius sucked in a sharp breath. Are you okay? Remus sat up slowly, wincing. Something cracked audibly in his back. What happened? His voice was scratchy, rough, likely from all the howling. Here. Sirius gripped his elbow, helping him to his feet. They walked slowly over to the bed, where Remus sat down heavily. Sirius withdrew the goblet that he had prepared with a weightless charm, whispering, Agramente. Remus accepted the water gratefully, spilling half of it down his chest in haste. What happened? He asked once he had finished drinking. Are you hurt? It's fine. Sirius pulled back the cloak a bit tighter around himself, covering his chest. You just nipped me a few times. You kept trying to get out. Panic laced across Remus's features. Did I? He reached out, grabbing Sirius's shirt. Sirius untangled himself, pushing him firmly back onto the cot and covering him gently with a blanket. No, we kept you here. You never left, I promise. Where are the others? They had to go. Pomfrey will be here soon. When you turned back, it was different. Harder than normal, I think. You wouldn't wake up properly, so James left me the cloak. I didn't want to leave you here. Remus stared up at the ceiling, dazed. His skin was very pale, and he was sweating slightly. Something really bad happened, he breathed, voice cold with terror, in a way that sent chills down Sirius's spine. He reached out, gripping the other boy's hand, unsure of what he should say. The moment they heard Pomfrey's footsteps on the stairs, Sirius ducked under the cloak and retreated into the corner as she bustled over to Remus, looking almost as pale as the sickly boy. Poppy! Remus pushed himself up, wincing. What happened? Please tell me what happened. How are you first? She avoided the question, placing a hand gently against his forehead. You're running very high. I feel fine. Remus shrugged her off. There was an attack, wasn't there? She nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. Remus's face fell. Who? How many? I don't know. The old nurse looked down at the floor, refusing to meet his eye. Under the cloak, Sirius's heart was pounding, chest sticky with blood. Please, Remus croaked. Pomfrey shook her head sadly. There's nothing I can tell you. It'll be in the morning news. I have to see Dumbledore. He's not here, she stood, glancing at the door. Now can you walk? Professor McGonagall says you're to go to your lessons as usual, if you're fit enough. We don't want anyone asking where you are. I'll give you something for the pain. Sirius scowled at that. Anyone with eyes could see that Remus was practically dead on his feet. But Moony just nodded, pushing himself up and following Pomfrey down the tunnel. Sirius trailed after them, still safely hidden under the cloak. The old nurse healed Remus as they walked, running her wand over the scratches and bruises. When they reached the castle, she slipped him a pain potion and told him to run along to class, but not to push himself too hard. Remus nodded, downing the potion in one gulp the moment she was out of sight. Sirius threw off the cloak. Why are you pretending to be okay? He hissed, wrapping an arm around the other boy's shoulders and helping to support him as they made their way back to the dorm. You can barely walk. I'll be fine. In a minute. Remus panted. It's got enough to worry about. Oh, fucking stairs. James said he'd send an owl to his dad right away, Sirius murmured, keeping his voice low. If anyone knows what's happened, the Potters will. Yeah, Yeah, Remus replied, breathlessly. Good. By the time they made it back to their room, Remus was wheezing, skin clammy with sweat. He collapsed onto his bed, trying to catch his breath, and Sirius bit his lip. You could just bunk off, he urged, exchanging a glance with the others. James was waiting by the window for his parents' response, and Peter was in front of the mirror, combing his hair. We do it all the time. Remus shook his head stubbornly. He clutched the wooden bed frames for support as he stood. Can't risk it. We've got arithmancy first. Snape's in that. If the papers are full of werewolf attacks and I'm not there, what do you want to bet? What do you want to bet he'll be the first to start stirring? I'm going for a shower. Just a minute. The moment the door locked behind him, James spun around to look at Sirius. How are you? He whispered, hurrying over. Let me see. Sirius winced, shrugging off his cloak. His shirt was sticky with blood. He'd have to throw it out. James paled. It looks worse than it is, Sirius whispered, keeping his voice low. Do you still have those bandages that you keep around for sprains? Yeah, James nodded, hurrying over to his trunk. Here. He tossed a roll of bandages at Sirius, who winced as he reached out to catch them. It's fine, he told himself firmly. You've dealt with worse than this. He turned his back to Peter and James as he shrugged off his shirt, grimacing when he looked down at the damage. 3 distinct cuts right across his ribs. He pointed his wand at his chest, murmuring one of the healing spells he'd tried to learn when he was 15. The blood on his skin disappeared, and for a moment the wounds stopped bleeding. But then they started again, blood trickling back down his ribs. Sirius wrapped the bandages quickly, hoping that they might be more effective at staunching the flow, and pulled on a clean shirt. He balled up the ruined one and shoved it under his bed. Mate, James eyed him as he turned around. Are you sure you're all right? Sirius nodded firmly. Never better. Werewolf attacks. Magical community demands action. Hundreds were affected by a string of brutal werewolf attacks during last night's full moon, which left 15 wizards dead and at least 5 missing, presumed kidnapped. None of the creatures responsible have been identified as of yet, and the Aura's office has advised everyone to be on high alert and to consult the published ministry guidelines on identifying and approaching werewolves, which are classified XXXX and considered highly dangerous. The interim Minister for Magic has been criticised for failure to maintain the werewolf register, established by Newt Scamander in 1947. Speaking for the opposition, Abraxas Malfoy released a statement in the early hours of this morning. Last night's attacks are further proof that the ministry is in dire need of reform, and on behalf of the ancient and law-abiding magical families of Great Britain, we demand stricter sanctions on half-humans and other undesirable and potentially dangerous elements. This statement has provoked outrage in what insiders are describing as an increasingly divided ministry. No names, James frowned, staring down at the paper. That's not good. Protecting the victims of the families, Sirius said weakly. Since when has the Daily Prophet cared about that? Lily scoffed, glaring down at the picture of Abraxas Malfoy. Since when has the ministry? Careful what you say, Peter hissed. My cousin, who works at the Prophet, said that they're being sent really strict guidelines on what they can write about the ministry, the war, everything. And there are spies everywhere checking on them, making sure no one's being too critical. Everyone fell silent at that, and Lily glanced nervously over her shoulder. But of course no one was listening. Everyone else in the Great Hall was far too busy talking about the news, same as them. It's not as if we're disagreeing with what the papers say, Marlene lowered her voice conspiratorially. I hate Malfoy's politics as much as the next half-blood, but he's right about the failures to register. The werewolves need to be contained, or stuff like this will happen. Dark Lord or not. That's ridiculous, Sirius bristled. An organised attack like this only happens when there's someone behind it. This would never happen without Voldemort goading them. He ignored the way his friends winced at the name. It was becoming a more common occurrence, as the word became more and more closely associated with the missing people and the violent curses and brutal attacks. They're still dangerous, Marlene shot back. I don't see why we're pretending that they aren't. It says right there. She pointed at the newspaper, classified 5X. I know it's unfortunate for them. They might have been perfectly normal otherwise, but facts are facts. Nobody seemed to know how to respond to that. Not even Sirius. The cuts on his chest were still bleeding. Across the table, Remus was ashen and sweating, hands trembling slightly as he focused on writing a letter. Sirius tried to avoid glancing at him too much, not wanting to draw any unnecessary attention, but it was difficult. Remus had hardly touched his food, and his mouth was a thin, grim line as he listened to Marlene rattle on. Sirius had to bite his tongue to keep from shouting at her to shut up. He continued to scowl at the back of McKinnon's blonde head as they left the hall, walking next to James. "Bloody insufferable," he muttered darkly. "Does she ever shut her mouth?" James gave him a sharp look. "Come on, mate," he whispered back. "She doesn't know. She's just repeating the things she's heard. Which is why it's so insufferable. Why does she have to go and act like everything's a crusade? Mooney already feels shitty enough." This was a fact that only became more apparent as the day wore on. Remus had done something to cover up his newest scars, and he kept a bottle of pepper-up potion clutched in his fist like a lifeline. But one look at him, and it was all too obvious that he was on the verge of collapsing. It made Sirius feel sick with worry, watching him wince and slump forward as they sat down for arithmancy. Sirius, James and Lily took their seats around Remus at the back of the classroom, doing their best to hide him from view. Lily sat next to him, reaching out every so often to pat his arm or squeeze his hand. Sirius and James took the desk in front, cracking jokes and levitating paper planes, and doing whatever they could to keep everyone distracted from the boy behind them. Sirius had a free hour afterwards, and jumped up immediately to walk Remus to his Care of Magical Creatures class. The other boy didn't say anything, just gave him a resigned look as they made their way out of the room. "Just bunk off," he begged, unable to keep quiet as he watched Remus limp down his third flight of stairs. "You've shown your face. Snivellers have seen you." But Remus continued, shaking his head stubbornly and gripping the banister like it was the only thing keeping him upright. They were nearly at the bottom of the steps when a group of third-year boys rushed by, giggling and shouting at each other. They weren't exactly paying attention on where they were going, and as one swerved around them, his bag swung and hit Remus, shoving him into the banister. The older boy hissed in pain as he banged against the unforgiving stone. Sirius had his wand out before he could even think. "Certus corpus!" he shouted, not caring who saw. The marble staircase turned into quicksand beneath the three boys' feet, and they yelped as they began to fall through. Sirius didn't realise the spell until they were half submerged in the staircase, leads dangling through the bottom. "Watch where you're going," he spat, glaring fiercely before turning back to Remus and helping him the rest of the way down the stairs. None of the passing students said anything or tried to stop him as they continued on their way down the corridor. Sirius was still in a sour mood by the time they reached the Care of Magical Creatures classroom. "You promise you'll go back and free them," Remus insisted. "I don't need you getting a detention on top of everything." Sirius rolled his eyes, as if detention was anything to be worried about. "If someone else hasn't found them," he agreed, grudgingly. "I only taught them a lesson. Any prefect would have done the same." Normally, that might have coaxed a smile out of Remus, but today the exhausted boy just stared straight ahead, blinking sluggishly as they approached the classroom door. "Right," Sirius said briskly. "I'll be back here in an hour to get you." "I don't need collecting, I'm not a child," Remus frowned. Apparently he still had enough energy to pout. "No," Sirius glanced around and risked reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You're my Mooney." Remus didn't reply, just dragged himself into the classroom. Sirius stood in the doorway, watching him leave.